So this video wasn't gonna come out for a few months, but then things moved fast. Some donations got made, and well, I wasn't the only one who was pressed for something like this. Um, so here we are. IFVs for Ukraine. Some donations are made, but we're gonna take a look at pretty much everything else that's kind of possible, reasonably speaking. And we're gonna look at a lot today. This is gonna be a long one, so strap in. I've got an intermission slide in the middle, which I know makes no sense for you, but it gives me a break, which is nice. But yeah, so IFVs. Where do we even begin? Well, why am I even talking about it? For those of you who are unaware, and I didn't make the changes just to prove my point here, talk about Marders and Bradleys have turned to commitments. Now, as far as actually showing up in Ukraine yet, I don't believe either Bradleys or Marders have, but training on these platforms has begun, I believe, and we'll probably be seeing those in the next few months, probably in time for like a mid to late spring offensive, if not into the summer. It could be faster than that. I have no idea. There's not a specific date, obviously, because they don't want the Russians to know. But yeah, Bradleys and Marders are being sent, and this is a stepping stone to heavier armor, with the UK committing Challenger 2s as well. So, yeah, we're in it now. The heavy armor is starting to roll, and that's why we got to talk about it, because it's happening. So, as I said, I'm going to talk about a lot. I'm covering a lot here. So we're going to take a look at the difference between AFVs, IFVs, APCs, and IMVs, and kind of the weird cyclical cycle of those. We'll take a look at wheeled and tracked vehicles, the pros and cons of both. We'll take a look at Ukraine's pre-war inventory, visually confirmed losses, donated and captured IFVs, Ukraine's unique territory requirements, their infrastructure, the difference between East and West IFV doctrine, the requirements that most countries, Ukraine included, would be looking at with an IFV, my requirements, so things that I kind of took into consideration when looking at some of the options we'll look at today. And I was going to put this into two parts, but I decided I'm going to try to speed run it and just cover as much as I can. So if this is an hour and a half plus, I'm sorry. Feel free to take breaks and come back. Then what would have been part two, or the second half of this video, we're going to take a look at pretty much everything out there. So the Bradley, the Borsuk, which is the Polish IFV that's in testing right now. The AMX-10RC, which is not an IFV, but it's been donated, so I wanted to just look at it here. The Marder, the Puma, the Warrior, the CV-90, the FNSS CV-15 from Turkey, the K-21 from South Korea, and I think I removed the Ratal because South Africa's probably not going to be super into sending things to Ukraine, since they're a little bit more aligned with the Russians in most manners. What would be the winning factors for some of these? So for Bradley and Marder, of course, they're already being sent, but we'll take a look at one other one, it's kind of a surprise, that would probably be a close follow-up. My personal thoughts, credits, and upcoming videos. So what is the difference between AFV, IFV, APC, and IMV? So kind of take it top down there on the right. Your armored fighting vehicle would be something like the mobile gun system there of the Striker or a tank. You can kind of stretch this definition if you wanted to cover things like SPGs. Kind of depends. Usually the implication is this is directly fighting an enemy. It's more of a direct fire versus an indirect fire weapon. Which also makes the Striker gun kind of weird to put there. But regardless, usually a vehicle that its primary goal is to fight. It is not there to carry troops. It is there to combat whatever's in the area. So your tanks, once again, your mobile gun platform is there. Then you have your IFVs, which would be the Bradley. It's going to carry a small contingent of troops. It's going to move along with other armor pieces, and it's there to provide said armor pieces infantry support. Likewise, if you don't have these larger AFVs in the region, but you still need some more firepower, you can send some Bradleys in, and they stay in the fight. They have the ability to take out tanks with the tow missiles. Their 25mm chain gun is more than enough to take out pretty much any infantry problems, as well as APCs and other IFVs. And even in some anecdotal cases, some older tanks. Then you have the APCs, which would be your striker. It's going to carry more troops. It's more lightly armored in terms of like his actual like armament, the gun. The armor itself, I think, varies. Usually you'll see heavier armor packages on the Bradley, but you don't see them as much on the striker because the striker is not really intended to drive up into the middle of a battle, right? Like the Bradley's closer to that. The striker is not necessarily meant to be in the fight with you. It does have some grenade launchers for smoke and cover, defensive measures, and it has usually machine guns or a Mark 19 grenade launcher. So you do have that capability, but generally you're going to offload your troops 100 meters away from your actual fight and let the troops move up on foot. Then you have your infantry mobility vehicles like the Hummer, and MRAPs would fall into this, but they have their own special designation because they're slightly modified, of course, for mine resistance. But these are kind of like your Jeeps. These are just to kind of get around. They're very susceptible to ambush and usually are kind of just that. They don't have a lot of armor. They're susceptible to mines, even some small arms fire, depending on. Sometimes they'll have a machine gun or a grenade launcher, but most of the time, it's just to get around. And we've seen the Ukrainians use these to kind of an APC-style thing, and it hasn't worked super great because they're very susceptible to ambush, but generally speaking, they're quick, they're maneuverable, but they're not going into a fight. So what is the difference between wheeled and tracked? The Ukrainians use both. Most modern militaries use some derivative of a wheeled vehicle as well as a tracked vehicle. So as we see here with the BTR and the BMP, you have two options. So for your wheeled options, your road speed's going to be higher, but you're not going to be able to operate as well on difficult terrain. So for things like cities, roadways, more urban, suburban areas, usually something like a BTR is going to have more benefit. Now, that's not necessarily to say that a BMP is not going to be as good, but generally, that's kind of where you're at. With tracks, you can handle more difficult terrain, and even to an extent, you can handle better turning radiuses. So, in some instances, urban streets work a little bit better towards like a tracked vehicle, but at the same time, you're not moving as fast, especially on roadways. But you can handle that rougher terrain. So usually your larger sweeping motions through fields or less urbanized areas, your tracked vehicles are going to be more competent. However, they're more complicated to maintain. So there's pluses and minuses to both, but generally speaking, that's kind of where you're sitting. So what was the pre-war inventory of Ukraine? Now keep in mind, these are not exact numbers. So these are estimates. BMP-1, they had a lot of variation. The 1 UM, and 1 AK all kind of combined to around 213, give or take. They had 35 BVP-1s, 40 BWPs, 56 PBV-501s, and 40 BMP-1A1s. BMP-2, 2K, and 2M roughly made up 890. I thought that was a little high, but generally looking at other sources, that seems to be ballpark kind of correct. It might still be a hair high, and that might count some mothballed or stored vehicles, but general consensus is around that. Then BMP-3, you had around 60. Now for your BTRs, which there are more Ukrainian variants of in terms of what they've actually done developmentally, your BTR-3, 3E, 3DA, there's 6 and 54 respectively, and your BTR-4, which are 4E, would be roughly around 67. So, what are the general specifications of BMPs? Keep in mind, each one of those variations could have any variety of changes to them, so these are the base model variations. Keep in mind, there's a lot of change there. So for your BMP-1, which would have been like think developmentally speaking, your late 60s to 70s, if I'm correct. I guess maybe mid to late 60s, but regardless, around that era. A 73mm 2A28 Grom low-pressure smoothbore short recoil semi-automatic gun with 40 rounds. So it's not an autocannon, but it is also pretty upscaled. So it's going to have more punch, just not firing as fast. Using also the 9M14 Malutka ATGM and a 7.62 PKT machine gun for any kind of infantry or personnel. Then, as far as your troop capacity goes, you have 3 crew, a gunner, a commander, and a driver, and then you have 8 dismounts. BMP-2 rocks a 30mm autocannon, the 2A42, the 9M113 Conquerors ATGM, and the PKTM machine gun, which is also 7.62. You do lose 1 troop here in terms of your dismounts, but it's the same crew setup as before. You can kind of think of the BMP-2 being in development around when the Soviets would have been at least considering, if not already, making preparations for Afghanistan. So something like the 30mm autocannon made a lot more sense than the Grom low-pressure gun. Since you're really not fighting armor, you're more trying to take out infantry behind cover. And a 30mm autocannon is going to take care of just about any cover. Then your BMP-3 kind of went a little nuts, and this would have been in development around, like, before, but would have been in its cycle by the time the Soviet Union collapsed. So its turret, and I think I've seen one with both of these, but it could be interchangeable as well. The 100mm 2A70 gunner launcher because it can launch an ATGM at the barrel, along with a 30mm 2A72 autocannon, the 9M117 Bastion ATGM, and the PKT machine gun as well. And you're sticking with your 7 dismounts. Once again, there's a lot of variation between each one of these, not only in terms of like what the Soviets produced, but each one of the different Soviet states kind of had their own variants that they would work on, and after the collapse, even more so. So there's a lot out there, but these are kind of the basic ideas to get you an idea of what they look like and how they operate. Your BTRs, your wheeled vehicles, usually lighter, going to have usually not necessarily the same troop capacity, but have a little bit more mobility in cities, or just roadways in general, I guess. So your BTR-3 base level had a 30mm ZTM-1 autocannon and a 7.62 machine gun. You have 3 crew, driver, gunner, commander, and 6 dismounts. Then for the BTR-4, 30mm to a 7.2 autocannon, 7.62 machine gun, a variety of ATGMs, and your troop dismount goes up to 8 here. Now, one thing, I don't know that the 3 had it, but the 4, from my understanding, does. The turret is remote controlled, so there's not like a person up in the turret. That is fully remote controlled from within the actual hull there, which isn't necessarily super weird, but it is something that's fairly unique to that variation and something that's a little bit more Western leaning in some instances. So what have the Ukrainians lost? Well, as you'll see here, a lot of BMP-1s, as you'd expect. They had a lot of them, they've lost a lot of them. But a BMP-1P, which I believe is the base version 228. Now, I know you're thinking, hey, that's more than they had at the start of this. Of course, that's factoring all visually confirmed losses, so that's anything they were able to reconstitute from storage, anything they were able to reconstitute from being captured, as well as any donations they may have received. The BMP-1TS1, the BMP-1U1, the BWP-11, the BPV-501A2, the BMP-2K, which once again, I believe base version 80, and 13 unknown variations of the BMP-1 or 2, the BVP-M80A1, the BMD-2, 4, the BTR-ZD1, the BTR-3, 34, and the BTR-4, 66. So as you can see here, they've lost a lot of BMP-1s and a lot of BTR-4s. So as far as like a wheeled versus track conversation, proportionally speaking, both are taking very heavy losses. It almost kind of wiping out what they had to initially start with. But as we know, as we've seen with the other videos I've talked about as far as tanks go, in their aircraft, a lot of things have been donated for either reconstituting things they had or just new units have been donated, usually for tanks and armor and stuff. So we'll at least look at donations here. The Czech Republic has donated 5 BVP-1s, as well as 56 PBV-501As back in April. Poland also donated 40 BWP-1s in April. Slovenia donated 35 BVP-M80As back in June. Greece and Slovenia, through the German arms trade program that they've got going on, where if you send any of your Soviet equipment to Ukraine, they'll backstop you with German equipment, but it's not a one-to-one trade thing. So some countries have been a little upset about it, but generally speaking, you're getting some pretty good stuff in most instances. But Greece traded or gave Ukraine 40 BMP-1As. I believe they might have got some armored vehicles out of that. But I think Slovenia, if I remember correctly, traded 30 BVP-1s for utility trucks that have a variety of uses, but they're one of the higher-end German utility trucks. So I think they got other stuff as well, but that was one of the big things that people are like, oh my god, they're trading trucks for IFVs, even though the trucks are like 30 years newer and very versatile. But regardless, doesn't matter. Then, of course, the cascade that we've had recently, France announced that they're going to be donating an undisclosed number of AMX-10 RCs, which is that wheeled guy down there with the big old gun. They didn't necessarily specify if it's RC or RCR, which is an updated version of the RC. They haven't said how many or when they will be in country. The estimates I think I've seen have kind of put it like within the next few months, but we don't know, and that we're probably not going to know until they're actually in country. But this is not an IFV. This is like a reconnaissance vehicle, or in some instances like a tank hunter. But generally speaking, the French, in a more modern sense, have used it in a recon role. However, they've not really fought any forces with tanks. So I guess they just kind of use what you have. The U.S. has announced they're going to be donating 50 or sending 50 Bradleys, as well as the Germans donating up to 40 Marders. So a fair amount. This is something that I think it's General Zaluzny. I think it's the head of someone high up in the Ukraine military structure, I believe. Had said they need, I think, 600 to 700 Western-style IFVs to push the Russians back to their pre-war borders. It's 90 of them right there, so we're making slow progress, but we're getting there. As far as captured go, now keep in mind, by the time you're seeing this number may have changed. But BMP-1P, once again, base version, I believe, 91, so makes up about half of the losses they've gotten already. BMP-1A16, BMP-2K, once again, I believe, base version, 222, so they're sitting really good with BMP-2s right now. BMP-2M, which I believe is the modernized version, 5. BMP-2675 SP3KDZ, that's a name. 2. BMP-364 MTLBM6MB, 2 of those. If I'm understanding correctly, that is not necessarily an IFV. That's closer to an APC, but it's like an older piece of kit. The BMD-252, BMD-4M11, and BTR-82A 119. So as far as like, it's not the same obviously as the BTR-4, but the BTR-82 makes up for pretty much all their BTR losses. So much like we looked at with their tanks, they're sitting very parallel to their losses in terms of what we've donated, what we've had donated, what we've captured, and what we've lost. They're actually sitting a little bit higher than they started the war with, but that's how it goes. So Ukraine's territory isn't necessarily super unique in terms of how a lot of these things were designed. Because you have to think a lot of modern day, especially Western pieces of armor, were designed for war with the Soviets. So they were designed to fight in places like Ukraine. So they aren't necessarily unmatched for this, but it is important to note what the terrain's like and what kind of the challenges might be around that. So we're not going to take a look at all of the terrain of Ukraine because most of it's not super important. We're really looking at the conflict areas, and since the Russians have been pushed back to the other side of the Dnieper, we don't have to really worry about it as far as like an obstacle. So we will be taking a look at the northern front, the northeastern front in Donetsk and Luhansk, and the southeastern front down there in Kherson and Zaporizhia. So let's take a look at the terrain. You can kind of see it here. If this is like hurting your eyes, if you're trying to focus on the actual terrain textures, you can go to Google Earth and see this as well. But as you see there, from Kherson to Melitopol, it's pretty much flat. Like there's some waterways. Usually, if you're looking at like the more concentrated green areas, you're looking at least a tributary, if not a fairly reasonably sized waterway. But generally, not a lot of actual hill territory there. Very flat, a lot easier for pieces of equipment to move across. Wheel, track, doesn't really matter. However, a lot of southern, like central, southern, eastern Ukraine are in river basins, so the land holds water quite well, which means, as we know, they get real muddy real fast certain times of year. So that's going to be one of those areas that's a bigger concern. Once you start going east of Melitopol towards Tokmak, I think that's how it's pronounced, you're going to start to see some hills. Now, it's not massive, of course, but you will have some riverways and some more difficult terrain. So your BTRs are not going to handle this quite as well. Now, it's not like Norway, right? It's not a mountain range, but it is something that will make maneuvering in that very blank space between Tomok and Kramatorsk more difficult, which is probably why you don't see any like large cities there. And then as we move kind of up towards Donetsk, Luhansk, you see Mariupol down there at the very bottom, you get a little bit of that same kind of wavy texture. You get some more waterways, but nothing like super concentrated. Now, by comparison, it is more concentrated in terms of waterways and hilly territory than that of Kherson or Zaporizhia. But it's still, like, once again, it's not Norway, right? It's not super difficult in terms of its maneuvering. However, the Donbass is where the civil war has been going on since like 2014, 2016, to some variety of that number. But that means this area is not only very heavily damaged in terms of like ongoing fighting, artillery, whatnot, but it's also very heavily fortified. So that's going to make maneuvering in some of these areas more difficult. And of course, when you're looking at like Donetsk or Luhansk or Kramatorsk, any of these cities that are a little bit more built up, you're going to have more difficulties with certain types of vehicles depending on the kind of operation. With a lot of the fighting we've seen in areas like this, particularly like the urban areas, being like pretty much house to house, it's not necessarily a bad thing to have either BTR or BMP, but you're moving very slowly. And when you have a bunch of houses or corners or anything where people can kind of hide, especially ATGM teams, those type of vehicles are more susceptible to damage versus like just going through a field and having the ability to kind of maneuver as they see fit. What about railways, though? This is something that people continually talk about because it is important, as largely speaking, the road network in Ukraine and Russia by extension isn't necessarily as vast. Both countries, a lot of post-Soviet states, are more railway focused, and a lot of Europe in general is as well, especially for like an American where Amtrak is like the only public rail we have and no one uses it. So railways are a conundrum to me. I don't understand them. But this is what we're looking at.
Now, I decided to focus here first because, well, there's a lot more rail networking here in the Donbass and Donetsk, Luhansk area. And this is where you're looking at your major supplies coming from. Since Russia and Ukraine and most post-Soviet states don't have as intricate of a road network, they're relying a lot more in terms of railways for their supplies. Now, as you see that little legend down there, which also has a credit down there, so thank you, Bucher.net. I'm not sure how that's pronounced. My bad. But you see the thinner lines or freight only. And you start to see them in that area I've highlighted. Where you have Kramatorsk over there on the left. On the other side of that big white gap, where all the other names are, is where a lot of the fighting is happening, particularly right now, the like more difficult areas with Soledar and Bakhmut. So these are pretty important regions in terms of your railway networks. The further they go, the Russians will be able to use a lot of that rail network. Same thing the other way. Now, of course, a lot of these rail networks could be damaged. One of the big problems with infrastructure is it doesn't move. So you can't really be like, oh, the enemy knows where a rail network is. They may shell it. But generally, you can kind of rest assured a little bit if they're kind of in the same situation where they need that for supplies. So it's important to note this is generally how movement of supplies is happening. Now, of course, up to the front's a little different. But for like just an American like me, I wanted to point this out because, like I said, we aren't big railway people. But if you look further down into Zaporizhia and Kherson, you see very little in terms of your rail network. This is a little bit more of a benefit/problem. As you see, there's one main railway that goes into Kherson, which I believe to the rest of the Ukrainian territory has been reopened, but that goes down into Crimea. Then you have another one coming out of Crimea up into Melitopol. These are vital in terms of supplying the Russians, which is why things like HIMARS have been pretty important in terms of striking not only supply hubs and stuff, but those major connections. Another point of why the Ukrainians have been consistently asking for AMTACs, as they give them more range to strike further in, so they're not damaging their own supply infrastructure as they move forward. But a lot more empty space here. So kind of keep that in mind in terms of how IFVs may operate in these regions. Now, in terms of roadways, you have some complexity. Once again, roadways are not as vital to the Ukrainians in terms of their normal infrastructure, but there are a couple of really important highways and roadways that we want to highlight here, or that I want to highlight, I suppose. So the MO3, MO4, very important. The E50, also pretty important. But as you see there on the left, that little clip out of the map, we have Bakhmut and we have Soledar, which is where like a lot of the fighting at the time of the recording of this video is happening. So this is probably going to come out in a week or two. So if things have changed, my apologies. But you have the E40 going down through there, and you have the T11302, two vital rail or roadways in terms of connecting supply lines and different things of that nature. With those fighting, if you start to lose those roadways, and Soledar is, as far as a roadway, not as important, but it does start to kind of go towards what the Russians, most people assume, are pushing for in an encirclement of Bakhmut. So the roadways are important. This is going to help its movement of troops, movement of vehicles, but also movement of supplies. Oops. Bloop. There we go. My bad. So we're looking at roadways once again, and Zaporizhia and Kherson actually have a more intricate roadway network. Now, of course, these are major roadways. These are not like all the little back roads and country roads. Keep that in mind. But here, the E105, M14 are your two big ones. Both of those intersect down there in Melitopol, which is why like the partisan activity in Melitopol has been pretty vital in terms of disrupting Russian supply, especially up to the front there in the Zaporizhia Oblast. Now, over towards Crimea, it's also pretty important, but as we've seen, those roadways, they're important, but the railways are more important. They connect both of these to Crimea. Depending on whether or not the Kerch Strait Bridge is fully back into operations, hard to say, but these are major ways of keeping their fronts pretty fully stacked and fully supplied, as well, at least as best they can. So what about the differences in doctrine? Well, the Soviets were the first to really step more into this role versus the West, at least, starting early development of the BMP-1 in 1966. I was right, mid-60s. This was something that the Russians were really hoping, the Soviets were really hoping, would give them a little bit more independence in terms of like what an individual unit could do. It would have more troop capacity just due to how like the Soviets were structuring things, and would have a more impactful main gun. Initially, the concept was, if we're fighting NATO, we want something that's not necessarily a light tank, but something that can fight their tanks, right? Because at the time, the West didn't have IFVs. We were like kind of dipping our toe, I guess we were, into APCs, right? The M113. But it's very lightly armored, so they didn't really need this gun. But once again, they were focused on, hey, if we can use this to like work as almost like a smaller tank effectively, to at least push back tanks, if not destroy them either with the gun or the ATGM, that's pretty cool. That's something we want. So they can operate more independently was the idea, right? Send a team in, they have heavy armor support, you don't necessarily have to dedicate a full tank column to it. But then, once again, that independence doesn't necessarily prove as beneficial as some would think if you're fighting like insurgents, right? You don't necessarily want to send like a whole armored column in there, but if you're not fighting armor, your ATGM and large gun aren't doing as much for you, thus the switch over to autocannons. Whereas the West took a while to get its feet under it, and the US was one of the last to actually jump on the board with the Bradley. They had kind of toyed around with M113s and what they could do with it, but generally the point was it was too lightly armored, and it just wasn't going to work as like a weapons platform. So the West, the US in particular, focused more on systems. So your optics, your fire control systems, things like the TOW, being able to do effectively the same thing, right? You're carrying some troops into combat, but instead of working as like more of an independent piece, this was designed to work in conjunction with more of your armored columns. So this was working with Abrams and Desert Storm as the troop complement to provide infantry support for your tanks. This was a pretty big deal. This was a massive success in Desert Storm. A lot of things went really well in Desert Storm. But even Iraq and Afghanistan, they saw a lot of success, even though they were kind of more phased towards forces using things like strikers, because, once again, if you're fighting insurgents who don't have tanks or heavy armor, the autocannon's useful still, but you're a vulnerable piece of armor that, you have some defensive systems, but enough RPGs or mines, you're going to have some pretty big issues. But survivability was also another main factor, much like with the Abrams and tanks of the era, for the West at least. So not too wildly different, but something that the Ukrainians are definitely going to notice when they start using the Bradleys and Marders. So in terms of requirements, now I put this as Ukraine's requirements, but most any country that's looking at procuring a APC, IFV rather, or developing one natively like a lot of countries do, they're going to be considering things like firepower. Firepower versus armor. So are we going to rock some ATGMs? What kind of gun are we using? Is that gun going to have munitions or the firepower to punch through certain types of other armor like IFVs, APCs, or even tanks? Then you have the concern of what about fortifications, right? What about bunkers? What about certain types of cover? And then what are you going to do about personnel, right? Now, that's kind of a defensive question as well. Of course, most of them will have machine guns, whether it's coaxial or independent. And you'll usually have some kind of grenade launchers for smoke or chaff. So you do have some defensive measures built in there. You're going to be pretty curious about troop capacity. If one of these is only carrying like 4 troops, you're going to need a whole lot of them. Luckily for the Ukrainians, there's not a huge disparity in terms of the amount of troops, Eastern or Soviet or Russian style IFVs carry and what the West does. And then mobility. Are they quick? Are they fast? Are they nimble? Can they go through certain types of terrain, as we'll see here in a minute? And then my requirements, because there are things that I thought were important to consider when looking at all of these different IFVs. It's track record. Luckily for us, while there are a few IFVs in testing right now, most of the programs over the last 10 years to replace existing IFVs have not gone super well. So the US is still rocking Bradleys. The Germans are still largely using Marders, even though the Puma's been in production for a while. The Ajax program is still kind of ongoing. So the Warrior's still operating in the UK. But a lot of the existing stock out there, a lot of things that are still in service have a track record. They've been places. So we can generally assess how well they've done and how well we think they may do in Ukraine. Then we want to look at production capability. Are production lines still active, or is this thing a piece of equipment that is no longer being produced? And if that's the case, is there a large amount of existing stock in terms of new hulls or hulls that can be used for parts, things of that nature? And then we'll take a look at ease of operation, ease of repairs. Generally speaking, pretty much all of them are going to have a similar degree of complexity in terms of being able to maintain and supply them, but pretty much all of them are operated by not super specific personnel, right? Like fire pilot, you don't need fire pilot training to drive a Bradley, but it is somewhat equivalent to Abrams, from my understanding, just slightly different. So here's the intermission. 30 minutes in, or 40 minutes in. I'm doing pretty good. I'm a little surprised at myself. So yeah, we're about to take a look at all the other types of IFVs I listed earlier. So let's get to it. Of course, we got to start with the Bradley. I'm American. This is where we're going to start. So the M2, A3, or A4. Now, I will say that I believe it's the M2A2 that is being sent to Ukraine. Some variety of changes, but generally speaking, I think the M2 still has the same general setup here. So your firepower, you're looking at the 25mm M242 Bushmaster chain gun with 900 to 1200 rounds, depending on the variant. The BGM background music 71 TOW anti-tank missile. It's usually done in a pair on the side of the turret. Then the 7.62 M240C machine gun. You'll have 3 crew, driver, gunner, and commander, and then 6 to 8 dismounts, once again, depending on. Then I believe the 6 might actually be the M3, which is the cavalry version, but that's neither here nor there. Very similar to that of the BMP in the BTR. And its mobility is about 35 miles an hour. It's fairly quick. It's not necessarily, the fastest thing. It's not a Ferrari, but it's, once again, pretty concurrent with everything we've seen. In terms of its track record, it did very well in the Gulf War. It has performed considerably well, I would say, in Afghanistan and Iraq. When it's used for the purpose it was developed for, it does very, very well. That being said, there are a lot of things in the Gulf War that aren't going to be the same as they are in Ukraine at the moment. Air cover is not something that's going to be nearly as available as it was during the Gulf War. In terms of maneuver with other armored columns, it's hard to say whether the Ukrainians are going to use it that way. This did incredibly well alongside Abrams, the Battle of 73 Easting, and just generally throughout the Gulf War, with, I believe, one of them being knocked out. And I can't remember. I think that might have been friendly fire. So the Iraqi tanks, the Iraqi IFVs didn't do that, if I remember correctly. That being said, there have been losses through Iraq and Afghanistan. I believe, I want to say it was like into the hundreds, like 150 maybe. I could be wrong about that number, so you may want to check into that. But I think it is collective between the two. When you're using it in like an counterinsurgency style thing, operation, it's not really working the way it was intended. You're not using it in large maneuvers with a lot of tanks. You're not moving with a tank column. You're like using it much more independently, which is kind of what the BMP was initially designed for. And you're lightly armored for all intent and purpose. So you're going to have some problems. You're going to run into mines. You're going to run into ATGM teams. And that's kind of the big problem you have in terms of the threat environment in that situation. Now, the ATGM teams are still going to exist in Ukraine, but it's not an insurgency. It's going to be slightly more clear as far as like where you're firing. But a lot of people have kind of theorized as far as what the Ukrainians may do with them, as, like I said, they're not really going to probably have the capability initially up front to use them in the capacity that they were used in the Gulf War, right? They do have armor. They've done maneuver before with large armored columns, but that's usually not like your day-to-day thing. So are they just going to save them for something like that? Are they going to use them more in support of infantry that's already fighting on the front lines like they've been doing with their BMPs and BTRs? Or are they going to kind of hold it a little bit further back and use the TOW missiles for anti-tank operations? There's a lot of things that can go on there, but regardless, that's kind of what we're looking at. Now, in terms of production capability, BAE land systems, BAE land systems and armaments have totally produced just under 7,000 of these bad boys. And these started production in the late 80s. So they've had a while to go, of course, but that's a lot. In fiscal year 18, the U.S. government approved the production of 473. I'm not 100% sure that's fully new production or if that is more kind of a mix of new and refurbishment of other pieces. Because that is something that BAE's pretty regularly doing year to year, is upgrading older pieces of equipment. Ease of operation, the training period for this is a few months, so it's not all that crazy to do. Now, of course, commanders, that's a little bit different, of course, but it's not all that different from like the BMPs, BTRs in terms of like the training period. And the Ukrainians have shown a pretty crazy tenacity in terms of picking up new pieces of equipment very quickly. In terms of repairs, this is something that might be a bit more of a problem in terms of maintenance, supplying it, repairing it. In more remote areas that the Bradley's been used in, getting parts to Bradley teams has been difficult. Now, if you're not using them in super isolated areas, it's not as bad, which may educate the Ukrainians' decision in terms of where they decide to use it. But regardless, something to consider. This is going to be pretty common across the board, but at least in terms of replacement parts and stuff, it's something that production can kind of keep up with, but probably not at the loss level, the loss rate that BTRs and BMPs have gone under. So hopefully the Bradleys stick around for a hot minute and they don't lose them in high numbers very quickly. Then you have the Borsuk, which is the Polish IFV that's currently in development. I put it here not necessarily because I think it would be donated to Ukraine, but it's something that maybe would be the next generation IFV for Ukraine. Hard to say, but I just wanted to throw it in here because, it's kind of an interesting thing. So it uses the 30mm Bushmaster Mark 44 S gun, 200 rounds. Of course, I believe that's kind of queued up. That's not stored. It'll have more than that, I'd imagine, because that's a very small amount of munitions. The Spike LR ATGM and the UKM 2000C machine gun, coaxially located there next to the 30mm. Troop capacity of 3 crew, once again, gunner, driver, and commander, with roughly around 6 troops in dismount. I'd imagine same deal. As you have different variants of this, that's going to change. And a mobility or a speed of 40 miles an hour, so it is going to go a bit faster than that of the Bradley, but of course it's also about 30 years newer. Doesn't have a track record, it's still in testing, so we don't know. Once again, next generation consideration. Production, unknown, but Poland's usually pretty good at being able to produce stuff, I think. That's more of kind of an assumption on my part. But generally speaking, the idea as far as like heavy machinery production, I'm fairly positive the Ukrainian or the Poland would be able to keep up with production, is what I'm trying to say. Ease of operation or repair, we have no idea. It's new. Probably if it is next generation parts, might be a little more difficult to come by if there's not like a stock of them already sitting back. The AMX-10C, once again, not an IFV, but it's getting donated, so I'm going to talk about it. It has a 105mm f2 BK Mecha L47 medium pressure gun with 38 rounds. It is important to note, this is not the same 105 that NATO tanks used to use. It is a different gun. As far as like the intricacies of it, you can find, I can't exactly remember who it was now. It might have been Maximus that had talked about this in particular and gave more detail on that 105. But there is another military equipment YouTuber that talks about that particular gun. Still fine as far as recon missions and in some instances anti-tank roles, but it's not the same tank gun. And then you have a 7.62 NF1 machine gun up there on top of the turret. 4 crew members, a loader, a gunner, a driver, and a commander, and a road speed of 53 miles an hour. So it is even faster, but once again, it is lighter. It is a reconnaissance vehicle that is not meant to ferry troops around. It has been used a lot of places. This has been in the French inventory for a hot minute. So it's been in Chad, it's been in Desert Storm, it's been in Kosovo, it's been in Mali, it's been in Afghanistan, and across the board, in pretty much all of those, it's done very, very well. Desert Storm, it actually was like the one major piece of armor holding down one of the flanks of the larger Allied push, so that was pretty impressive. But yeah, I mean, the French have used this thing a lot of places in, largely speaking, desert environments. So kind of take that as you will, but having served in Kosovo, and of course France is not a desertous region, so it has operated in more European-style environments. It will probably do just fine for the Ukrainians. It's no longer in production, but up to 464 of them have been built. Since this is not designed as a frontline IFV or a PC, there's no need to really produce thousands of these things. The reconnaissance vehicles are used by very specialized teams. In terms of ease of operation, it's not necessarily something that's going to be that drastically more complex. It's just usually your reconnaissance teams are more specialized in that area versus, hey, we're like training for this very highly difficult piece of equipment. And ease of repairs, this is something the French have been using a long time and have been pretty good as far as like being able to airlift parts and get parts to more remote regions. So this one probably shouldn't have any issues as far as parts procurement, as long as the French are able to provide those. Then you have the Schützenpanzer Marder, or the Marder. It uses the 20mm Rheinmetall Mark 20 RH202 autocannon with 1,250 rounds, similar to that of the Bradley, a little bit higher end on that, but still. Using the Milan ATGM and the 7.62 MG3 machine gun. Has a troop capacity of 3 crew members, a driver, a gunner, and a commander, and 6 dismounts. Pretty much similar to what we've seen so far, with a road speed of 47 miles an hour, so actually very close to the AMX-10RC. It's very quick. Whether it's going that fast regularly is hard to say, and with these being a little bit older, not 100% sure that's advisable, but the capability's there. It has taken part in operations in Kosovo and Afghanistan. As far as like major losses, there's not been any real big problems with them. It's fared about as well as the Bradley has. It just hasn't been as many operations. It's no longer in production, but Germany did build up to just over 2,000 of them. So they have probably a fair few in inventory. However, the battle readiness of them is a slightly different question. And with a lot of the Bundeswehr still using these as opposed to the Puma, because the Puma's still in production and each batch is going through its whole testing phase, it's been a pretty slow process. So there's still, like I said, about half of the teams that are dedicated IFV teams are still using older Marders. So we're probably not seeing those getting sent. And Rheinmetall has already said that, well, they have, I believe, the 40 to send. Upgrading, making serviceable any more of these, and I believe Leopards 1 and 2 will take probably a year. Whether or not that's fully accurate, it's hard to say, but that's just something I believe the CEO of Rheinmetall had said, like today or yesterday. So, yeah, we'll keep that in mind as far as future allocations, but regardless, the Marder is still going to be a very vital piece of equipment for the Ukrainians. Once again, ease of operation, pretty much like the Bradley. It's not overly complex. It does require some training, nothing more than a few months, and the Ukrainians are picking things up very quickly. As far as ease of repair, once again, nothing vastly different than anything we've seen. Mechanically speaking, not super different from the BMPs. Systems-wise, going to be a little different, of course, but the biggest problem I believe we're probably going to look at is having some kind of parts breakdown. If the Germans, Rheinmetall, are using a lot of parts to bring a lot of these back into service, they may not have the spare parts to allocate to Ukraine. With the way we've seen things organized so far, I wouldn't be super surprised if that's the case, but I also wouldn't be surprised the other way, right? There has been a level of competency in a lot of this as far as the Germans have gone, but there's also been very publicized instances of kind of incompetence or just not thinking very far forward. There's a lot of reasons for that. I'm not going to get into it, but generally speaking, I think that's something to be concerned about, but I don't think it's going to massively hamper the capability of the Marders being sent. Then you have the Schützenpanzer Puma, 30mm Mark 32 ABM autocannon with 400 rounds. Once again, I think that might be queued up. I don't know if that's stored, because if that is all of them, that's not a high number. The Spike LR ATGM, a 5.56 H&K MG4 or a 7.62 MG5 machine gun, and then a six-shot 76mm grenade launcher. Those have actually been on like pretty much everything we've looked at. They're defensive measures I talked about earlier. So you're not using these offensively, but it's usually going to smoke or try to intercept any kind of oncoming missiles, things like that. Troop capacity, you've got your driver, your gunner, commander, and 6 dismounts, and it has a road speed of 43 miles an hour. Now, I know you're thinking, hey, wait a second, isn't the Marder faster? And technically, yes, but once again, the Pumas are new. The Marders are not. So whether or not Marders are actually cruising around at near 50 miles an hour is hard to say. But once again, most of the time you're not cruising around at max speed. So it is nice to have that capability, but it's also not something that you're like, we got to just go full 43 miles an hour. Let's go. As far as its track record, it's not been into combat, but it has had some trials and tribulations through its tests and trials. Now, that being said, none of them, like the more recent trials that each production batch goes through, have been catastrophic failures, but they do have some QC issues, it does seem. So, this is something I wouldn't imagine that the Ukrainians would get unless this war drags on for a long time, and support from the West continues for that long time. It is currently in production, though, and up to 350 have been built. So, ideally, the Germans would max out their forces with these, provide everyone, each team that is rocking Marders with a Puma, build some backstock, and then, if the time comes, maybe consider it. But you're probably looking at a post-war procurement of something like this if Ukraine decided to go this route. Ease of operations, as far as like moving from Marder to Puma, it's not drastically different. You have some training, but it's not like a whole new piece of equipment. And then ease of repair is kind of the same situation, but since it's in production of those parts and stuff is a little bit better. Once again, they are still kind of in that growing pain of development in a way. So kind of take that as you will. The Warrior, the FV 510 Warrior, 510 Warrior, rocking the 30mm L21A1 Rodden cannon, also using the 7.62 L94A1 coaxial machine gun, as well as a just 7.62 machine gun. Troop capacity of 3 and dismount capability of anywhere 7 to 10 depending on the variant. And a road speed of 46 miles an hour. So it's fast, it carries a lot of troops, it has a very powerful gun. However, I didn't actually put a round count here. This could just be a kind of a gaffe on my part, because I've had to go back and change this several times, because as I said at the beginning, I wasn't going to do this video until like May. But, you know, France was like, hey, how about some AMX 10RCs? And I was like, oh, okay, whatever. And then the US and Germany are like, hey, we're going to send Bradleys and Marders. And I was like, no, you've got me to do this video. I mean, good for Ukraine. I'm glad they're getting them. But this was a slight rush, so keep that in mind. If, like, I'm doing my best to provide basic information as I kind of do in all my videos. Perun did a video like today, while this morning, the day I'm recording this, about this topic roughly. Not, of course, covering the same information, but like the more in-depth examination of IFVs being sent to Ukraine, the capability of what is being sent, the capabilities they had before. So definitely check that video out. Like, I am in my best mind a stepping stone to someone like Perun. So definitely go check out the master of the YouTube slideshows. And then you have a pretty extensive track record, because it's been in service a long time. The Gulf War, Bosnia again, Iraq and Afghanistan. I think probably one of those was either supposed to be Kosovo or Bosnia and the long H word, I can't remember, I'm sorry. Anyway, performed very well in the Gulf War. Didn't really do a lot in Kosovo and Bosnia. Iraq and Afghanistan, kind of similar situations to the Bradley. IFVs in those kind of counterinsurgency style things aren't as useful as they are in like big armored sweeps. So, once again, did well in the Gulf War, would probably do pretty well here in numbers. However, it's no longer in production. The Ajax is going to replace it at some point, but they did build just over 1,000 of them. So, as far as inventories and stuff, they'll probably have a decent number. Of course, not all 1,000 of them, obviously, but they will have probably a couple hundred at least, ideally. And if they're thinking about sending Challenger 2s, I think the confirmation's there, but I don't know that like it's been fully... I don't know how the process works of sending tanks from the UK. The Prime Minister had said, hey, we're going to do it, but I don't know if like he has to get approvals from different people. But they're sending, I think, I've seen anywhere from 10 to 14, so kind of take that as you will. But I would imagine Warriors are probably not far behind, especially the US and Germany sending Bradleys and Marders. Ease of operation's kind of the same. Once again, it's not all that drastically different in terms of using any of the other Western-style equipment, whether it's the German, the US, or the UK version of it. And parts and stuff haven't been all drastically different from the Bradley and the Marder. However, I don't think it's been in such an isolated situation that like the Bradley's been in a couple of instances where they weren't able to get parts to it. And with Ukraine having some isolated regions, but generally having enough access to most of the front that getting parts to certain regions probably would not be all that difficult. Not to say it's easy, but it's something that's very possible and something they've been doing. Then you have the CV-90, which I'm surprised does not get as much talk in this conversation, as this is like... it's not the Marder, but there's a lot of countries that use this thing. So it uses the 40mm Bofors L70 autocannon, big boy gun, a 7.62 machine gun, the KSP M39, and it has, of course, those grenade launchers, once again, for protective purposes. A crew of 3, driver, gunner, commander, and 7 to 8 dismounts. It also has a speed of 43 miles an hour. So carrying roughly effectively the same number of troops most of your BMPs and BTRs have the capability of doing, with a lot of firepower. That 40mm Bofors is pretty sick. It has been in combat in Liberia and Afghanistan. It's performed admirably in both of those positions. So this is something that has been tested. It has been in combat. It has been used. Wouldn't be all that ridiculous for something like this to end up in Ukraine, but not going to be the headline catching Bradley, because CV-90, I guess, doesn't ring quite as well, I suppose. But it is still actively in production. Like I said, there's several different countries that use this. As you can see, it is Swiss. Swedish, not Swiss. I'm sorry, the Swedish and Swiss people from Sweden and Switzerland. I am sorry. Geographically, I confuse the two. I don't know why. They're not like next door neighbors, but whatever. It's whatever. It's still in production. A lot of the Nordic countries use it. A lot of Europe uses it as well. And just over 1,200 have been built. So this is like, as far as stockpiles and in production, that's probably one of the best bets next to something like the Bradley. Ease of operations, once again, not all that drastically different. Conscripts and stuff have been able to use this in some of the countries that it's used in. Ease of repair, not something that's ever been brought up as far as like a big issue outside of just normal logistics problems. So this would be something very reasonable. I don't know that... Yeah, I have seen people pose the idea of using IFVs as kind of like pseudo anti-air platforms with their autocannons. I don't know that the targeting systems would work quite as well there. I don't know that the 40mm Bofors might be a little overkill for that, but it's still something that this is, if I'm thinking of a black sheep, is this one. I don't think I've heard enough people talk about the CV-90 in this conversation. Then you have the FNSS ACV-15, using the 25mm FNSS sharpshooter turret. It also has a 7.62 machine gun and some defensive grenade launchers as well. A crew of 3, driver, gunner, and commander, and 8 dismounts with a road speed of 40 miles an hour. Now, if you're looking at this and saying, this looks kind of like a weird M113, you're not far off, because it's based on the M113. They didn't just slap armor on it. It is like something that went through development, but it does have a very similar form factor. But it does have armor and stuff on it. So, hasn't seen combat though. Oddly enough, you think something like this would have probably seen some action in Syria, with the Turks being to varying degrees of involved there. But it is still actively in production, and just under 3,000 have been built. So this is something as well I'm kind of surprised we've not seen any talk about. Now, I know that with the Turks, there's some baggage, there's Russian relations and stuff, but the Turks are also the ones who've been building like the Corvettes and stuff for Ukraine in kind of their future navy. So I'm very surprised this doesn't end up conversations. It's not as renowned as the CV-90, but there's a ton of them. Of course, there could be some problems being based on the M113, but the Ukrainians have a lot of M113s and are very used to using them at this point. Ease of operations, I haven't heard anything necessarily as far as like when I was looking through to see. There's no real combat record of this. Doesn't seem to have any issues. Same deal with repairs. If it does have a fair amount of part similarity with M113s, this might actually be a little bit more beneficial to the Ukrainians from that aspect as far as repairs and parts and things. But yeah, I thought this was kind of an interesting little one that I think the capability and possibilities there, but I think it would have to be a purchase, right? And there's a lot of conversation that would happen in that versus something of like, hey, we're just going to give you like a lot of these, because once again, the Turks are in a weird middle ground as far as still maintaining relations with Russia and stuff. Then you have the K-21, the South Korean IFV, using the 40mm SNT Dynamic K-40 autocannon with 2 Hangyong ATGM, I'm sure I pronounced that wrong, my apologies to any South Koreans watching, and the 7.62 M60 GPMG, general purpose machine gun, I believe. A troop capacity of 3 crew, once again, driver, gunner, and commander. I could have just said at the top of this that they're all going to be the same, but, I'm me, I suppose. And 9 dismounts. So you can house a lot of troops in this. It's actually an upgrade by comparison, with a road speed of 43 miles an hour. Hasn't seen combat, though. It is in production, but only 466 have been built. So kind of take that as you will. From my understanding, and it would make a lot of sense for something like this does not have the same semi-active hydropneumatic suspension system that the K2 has. So it's kind of just a pretty standard IFV at that point. Ease of operations, kind of the same deal as far as like the CV-90s and conscripts. With a couple of months training, can use this same deal on maintaining it. A little bit longer in terms of training there, but not impossible, not something the Ukrainians wouldn't be somewhat at least similar to in terms of their understanding of these types of vehicles. But no one's talking about this. Probably much more reasonably so than the Turkish example or the CV-90. But this is something that, well, the K2 and the K9 get a lot of love. I haven't seen anyone talk about the K21 in terms of procurements. They also don't build a whole lot of these, so you can kind of take that as you will. Winning factors. The Bradley, of course, it's already being sent. The Marder, of course, being sent. Both are battle tested. The UK, I'm surprised to not be like, hey, we're going to send Warriors too. It could be also, since the Ajax program is still kind of going through its paces and hasn't entered low-level production yet. Maybe they're waiting on that. But they were like, hey, we're going to send Challenger 2s. So good on you, UK. Send those Challenger 2s. You guys do that. But yeah, I mean, the Bradley and the Marder being sent for a reason. They're both very good. They're both things that the Ukrainians have probably, in meetings with different officials from these countries, been specifically asking for. And they add more capability than what the Ukrainians had. As I said, that focus on systems is not something that, even with the Ukrainian variants of the BTR, their kind of more indigenous and development programs, didn't necessarily have the same capabilities, even with the older M2s and the older Marders. So these are going to be big deals. Now, the numbers that have been committed are not as great in that degree, but it is something that should be considered. These are going to make a big difference to Ukraine. So some of my personal thoughts. I'm a little surprised that the French kind of took the lead here. There's been kind of a lot of contribution in terms of credit, in terms of the French being the first to step up and say, hey, we're going to send these 10, the AMX 10 RCs, and that kind of having the ripple effect to the US and the Germans. So I've seen some people kind of speculate this was probably meant to be like a joint announcement, but Macron was like, yo, we're doing this, and everyone's like, oh, okay. All right, guys. But it is interesting. Like, a lot of focus gets put on Germany, but it seems like France may be kind of committing slightly more in terms of like trying to push their influence in Ukraine, which, is beneficial to the Ukrainians at this point in terms of having this armor sent. And this is a big step towards sending heavier armor. This is like a dedication to saying, hey, if we're going to send these IFVs and you use them really well, we're in, right? We're going to send other things. And that leads to the discussions of things like the Challenger 2 being sent, which doesn't have, like, the Challenger 3 is not in any rate production at this point. So this is a pretty crazy thing to be like, hey, this is, I mean, it's probably not obviously from like their active tank force, but they do have a limited number of tanks, and tanks aren't just getting busted out like, 50 a day or something. But it has started a lot of conversation with smaller countries that operate Leopards, Leopard 2s, and a varying degree of A4, A5, things like that. Of just having like an international coalition of Leopard users to send Leopards. Now, there's been a lot of talk as far as like, oh, countries are sending Leopards, but pretty much in every instance, and I'm pretty sure every instance,
all of these countries have to have Germany's approval. And even though Germany sent Marders, they've on multiple occasions so far since been like, we have no interest in sending Leopards at this time. So we'll see, because, one of the things that could happen is if these Leopards get sent, either the Germans aren't going to have the parts for them, and that may be part of the calculus here. Maybe they're using the parts for themselves. Maybe they're using the parts to refurbish those other machines that Rheinmetall's like, hey, we can get these up and running, but it's going to take like a year. Or it's going to have to come from the stockpiles or the production lines of the other countries, and that's effectively 5 different logistics chains. Because I think it's 5 different countries that have signed on and said they're willing to do it. I believe it's Poland, Finland, and Denmark at this point, but the other 2 I don't think have specified who they are. But yeah, that's pretty nuts. And effectively, of course, the losses in combat's going to be a thing, but I wouldn't be super surprised, and I'd fathom a pretty good guess that these types of these types of pieces of equipment, like the Bradley, the Marder, those that survive the war are probably going to be mainstays in the post-war Ukrainian army. So I would imagine the Challenger is probably going to be something similar to that, even being out of production. And then, of course, Leopard 2s as well. But my credits, wikis, of course, for basic information, either Wikipedia or the military wiki. Tank Encyclopedia, especially for armor, great resource, especially for graphics, but also for information that isn't going to show up on some of those wikis. Military Today, Oryx, DefenseIndustryDaily.com, Go Army. As far as like training periods for the Bradley, that's the reason they're here. And then a lot of people have been talking about this on the YouTubes, as you would suspect. So Task and Purpose, Battle Order, Perun, Chieftain, Red Effect. Like I said, Maximus, I know, has covered some of the pieces of equipment we've talked about, especially the British ones. But yeah, I mean, all of these channels are great. These are the channels I hope that I'm a stepping stone to. So if you guys want that deeper information, these are the channels to check out alongside Maximus. Sorry, I didn't put them there. But yeah, they all provide more in-depth information. And as you see in the top right there, Battle Order, like 2 days ago, put out a video talking about the organization of Ukrainian mechanized brigades. And that's what that's from. Phenomenal video. If you want to know more about the organizational structure and like the order of battle, if you will, Battle Order, chef's kiss. Perun, like I said, did that video literally the day I'm recording this. So all of these people, phenomenal. I do the masters of their craft. So yeah, check all of those out. Go subscribe to all those channels if I'm even vaguely interested. If you're an hour and 14 minutes into this, these are channels you're gonna like. If you've stayed this long, just go check them out. If you're not familiar with them already. And what am I going to talk about next? Well, Romania's next MBT is the next video up. Then I will probably be talking about either the Ukrainian Black Panther, my case for it, or maybe the New Zealand Gripens, the Kiwis Gripens. Then the Czech Republic's next main battle tank, and then the upcoming crises in China, or the upcoming Chinese crisis. That is going to be kind of my first foray in terms of videos into geopolitics, so I do apologize if that upsets anyone. I'll be doing a similar thing with Russia, so kind of keep that in mind. But yeah, that's it. So thanks for sticking around for just over an hour. I'm impressed I got this in under an hour and a half. Just golf claps for me, I guess. Hope I didn't rush too fast. But thanks for watching, guys. If you have any questions, put them in the comments down below. I'll do my best to answer them. And I'm sure I missed a lot of stuff. Like I said, I'm trying to give a just very basic, broad understanding to some of these things. So fill me in on things I am unfamiliar with, or that I got wrong, or that I'm missing. Eternally grateful to you guys for that. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.